The Silence Before the Anunnaki, a gap in the tablets. There is a period of human history that has been written about, excavated, analyzed, and archived, and yet a portion of it, the portion that matters most, does not exist in any record. Not because it was lost. Not because the clay decayed or the fires consumed it. The silence is too precise for that. Too consistent. Too complete. Mainstream archaeology tells us civilization began in Sumer approximately 3500 BCE. The Sumerian king list, one of the most studied ancient documents in human history, describes rulers who governed this earth for tens of thousands of years before a great flood erased everything. Scholars call these entries mythological. But they have never adequately explained why the mythology and the archaeology ceased to align at precisely the same moment in time. Every origin story humanity has ever told itself points back to this region. This era. These tablets. If something was deliberately removed from that record, then everything constructed upon it, every civilization, every written law, every institutional understanding of human origins, rests on an edited foundation. And the editor has never been identified. From the first excavations of Mesopotamia, through the suppressed translations of the 19th century, all the way to the most contested findings in modern Assyriology, this investigation will follow the evidence wherever it leads. Regardless of where that is. If this investigation matters to you, subscribe now and stay with us. Every episode goes deeper. We begin. Chapter 1, The World Before the Flood Kings. Consider what it means to hold in your hands a document that is older than the concept of writing itself is supposed to be. Not metaphorically older. Literally, a text that describes a world that should not yet have possessed the technology to produce it. In 1853, a British excavation team working along the banks of the lower Euphrates pulled a clay tablet from the earth at a site near the ancient city of Nippur. The foreman of the dig, a man whose name does not survive in the official record, wrapped the object in cloth and sent it to London without properly documenting its precise location within the stratum. Scholars would later spend decades debating not only what the tablet said, but where exactly it had come from, which layer of earth, which century of sediment. That dispute was never fully resolved. What was resolved, eventually and with considerable reluctance from the academic establishment, was what the tablet described. A list of kings. Their cities. The lengths of their reigns. And a dividing line, clearly marked in the cuneiform, separating two eras of human governance so different from each other that they do not appear to belong to the same civilization at all. The Sumerian king list, as it came to be known, is not a single document. It is a tradition, a set of overlapping texts produced across several centuries that collectively catalog the rulers of ancient Mesopotamia from the earliest period of organized kingship to the dynasties of the historical record. The oldest surviving copies date to approximately 2100 BCE, though the tradition they record is considerably more ancient. The document is structured in a way that is simultaneously precise and deeply strange. For the dynasties of the historical period, the kings whose names can be cross-referenced against other administrative records, whose cities have been excavated, whose reigns can be roughly dated, the king list is largely accurate. It is a reliable administrative document, the kind of careful institutional record-keeping that a literate bureaucratic civilization produces as a matter of governance. And then, above the dividing line, before what the text calls the flood that swept over the earth, it becomes something that mainstream archaeology has spent over a century attempting to categorize. 8 kings are named before the flood. 8 rulers assigned to specific cities, with specific reign lengths attached to each name. The city of Eridu is listed first, the place where, according to the text, kingship first descended from heaven. Its first ruler, Al-Yalim, is recorded as having reigned for 28,800 years. The second ruler of Eridu, Alaugur, governed for 36,000 years. At the city of Bad Tibra, a king named Demused, whose name will appear again in other Sumerian texts in very different contexts, is credited with 36,000 years of kingship. The total pre-flood reign across 8 kings and 5 cities amounts to 241,200 years. The document does not present these figures as estimates, or as symbolic representations, or as mythological elaborations. It presents them in the same scribal register, using the same administrative notation, as the historically verifiable reigns that follow the flood division. The tone does not change. The format does not change. Only the numbers are different, and the nature of what is being described. The academic response to this has been, broadly, to classify the pre-flood section as mythological accretion, a ritual preamble added to a historically grounded document in order to legitimize the authority of later kings by connecting their lineage to a divine or semi-divine past. This is a reasonable interpretation. It has the advantage of requiring no revision to the established archaeological timeline. It has the disadvantage of not fully explaining several features of the text that do not fit neatly into the mythology category. The cities named in the pre-flood section, Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larak, Sapar, and Shurapak, are all real cities. They have all been excavated. They all show evidence of occupation at extraordinary antiquity, in some cases reaching back to the late 6th millennium BCE, before the conventional date for the emergence of writing, before the emergence of complex social organization as archaeology currently defines it. The King list names these cities as the seats of pre-flood governance. Archaeology confirms that something was present at these locations far earlier than the mainstream narrative comfortably accommodates. The scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent much of the 20th century translating and contextualizing Sumerian literature, was among the first to argue seriously that the pre-flood section of the King list could not simply be dismissed as invention. His position was not that the reign lengths were literal. He was not arguing that any individual human being governed for 28,800 years. His argument was more precise and more troubling, that the cities, the sequence, and the administrative structure of the pre-flood section appeared to encode something real, something that had actually existed, something that the scribes who produced the King list were attempting to record, within the limitations of a symbolic and numerical tradition that predated their own writing system, as accurately as they could manage. That argument has never been refuted. It has been marginalized, reclassified, and progressively excluded from mainstream academic discourse. But it has not been refuted. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference matters. Consider an analogy. Imagine that archaeologists in the year 3000 CE excavate a site in what was once the eastern United States and discover a government document, a census or an official list of administrations, that accurately records every American president from George Washington to the late 21st century. The dates are correct. The sequences are correct. The names correspond to other surviving records. And then, above Washington's entry, the document lists 10 additional administrations, each assigned to a specific city, each with a duration measured not in years but in centuries. The archaeologists of the year 3000 classify the pre-Washington section as mythology. They note that it resembles the mythological founding narratives common to many pre-modern cultures. They proceed on this basis. The question their classification cannot answer is this: why did the people who produced this document, a document demonstrably accurate in every verifiable section, choose to fabricate a precise administrative record for a period they knew to be fictional? Why not simply begin with Washington? Why construct an elaborate false prehistory in the same register, the same format, the same bureaucratic tone as the verified history? The Sumerians, like most ancient cultures, had mythological traditions that used a completely different register. They knew the difference between a myth and an administrative record. They produced both. The King list looks like the latter. After the flood division, the King list resets. Kingship descends from heaven again. The phrase used is identical to the one used at the beginning of the pre-flood section, and a new sequence of dynasties begins. These post-flood dynasties still begin with extraordinary reign lengths, though they are shorter than the pre-flood figures and diminish progressively toward historical norms. By the time the text reaches the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, the reign lengths are measured in decades rather than millennia, and the names begin to correspond to rulers known from other surviving records. The document converges, gradually, toward verifiable history. The convergence is not accidental. It suggests a sophisticated scribal awareness of the difference between the periods being described, an awareness that what came before the flood was of a fundamentally different order than what came after it. The scribes did not mix the two traditions carelessly. They separated them clearly with a marked boundary. And they placed something specific on the other side of that boundary. 8 kings. 5 cities. 241,200 years. And a name for the beings who presided over that era, which will recur across the entirety of Mesopotamian literature in contexts that no purely mythological interpretation has ever satisfactorily explained. The word Anunnaki appears for the first time in recorded history in a text so fragmentary that 3 generations of scholars spent the better part of 40 years debating whether it referred to a class of divine beings, a council of judges in the underworld, a title of royal authority, or an administrative designation of uncertain meaning. The debate was not resolved by consensus. It was resolved, or rather displaced, by the discovery of more tablets. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of additional cuneiform texts from the sites of Nippur, Lagash, and Eridu that contain the same word in varying contexts. And what those contexts revealed was something that did not map cleanly onto any category that the 19th and early 20th century framework of ancient Near Eastern mythology was equipped to handle. In the Sumerian language, the term Anunnaki is generally rendered as those of princely seed, or alternatively, the offspring of the sky god Anu. The structural analysis of the word is reasonably well established. An meaning sky or heaven, Nun meaning prince or great, Ki meaning earth. The beings of heaven and earth, one plausible translation runs, or the great ones of heaven and earth. These translations are not disputed in their broad outlines. What is disputed, and what has been the source of sustained, occasionally bitter academic controversy for over a century, is the nature of the entities to whom this term was applied, and the consistency of that application across the full range of surviving Mesopotamian texts. In the earliest Sumerian literary sources, the Anunnaki function as judges. They are described as sitting in assembly, deliberating on matters of cosmic and terrestrial significance, and issuing judgments that carry the force of divine law. The Descent of Inanna, one of the oldest surviving narrative poems in human history, describes the Anunnaki as the 7 judges of the underworld, beings of extraordinary authority who sit before Inanna and pronounce her fate during her descent into the realm of the dead. This underworld function has been the primary basis for the standard mythological classification. The Anunnaki as a pantheon of chthonic deities, divine judges presiding over death and the afterlife, analogous to similar figures in Egyptian and later Greek religious tradition. This classification is not wrong. It is incomplete. When the Anunnaki appear in non-narrative, non-poetic contexts, in administrative texts, in royal inscriptions, in the preambles to legal codes, they do not appear as mythological judges of the underworld. They appear as the original governing authority of the earth. The prologue to the Laws of Hammurabi, produced in Babylon in approximately 1754 BCE, invokes the Anunnaki as the cosmic assembly that granted Hammurabi his authority to rule. Not as mythological figures lending symbolic legitimacy to a human king, the language is more precise than that, and Hammurabi's scribes were not imprecise people. The Anunnaki are described as the beings who established the foundations of kingship, who assigned the territories of the earth, and whose decisions about governance preceded and authorized every human political structure that followed. They are not invoked as gods in the sense that Zeus or Osiris are gods, figures of a spiritual pantheon whose relevance to political authority is metaphorical. They are invoked as the prior administrators, the ones who were here before. The Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text dated to approximately 1700 BCE but almost certainly encoding a much older tradition, provides the most detailed surviving description of the Anunnaki's role in human origins. The text is explicit. The Anunnaki are described as the great gods who imposed labor upon the lesser gods, the Igigi, and when the Igigi rebelled against this labor after 40 years, the Anunnaki decided to create human beings to perform the work instead. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic is not a cosmic act of love or a philosophical mystery. It is an administrative solution to a labor problem. The Anunnaki require a workforce. The Igigi have revolted. A new category of being is therefore engineered specifically to fill that role. The language used to describe this process has generated more scholarly controversy than almost any other passage in Mesopotamian literature. The verb employed for the creation of humanity is the same verb used elsewhere in Sumerian texts to describe the modification of existing materials, not creation from nothing but alteration of something that already exists. The precise implications of that linguistic choice have never been agreed upon. They have, however, been consistently noted by scholars who have no interest whatsoever in non-conventional interpretations. The language is what it is. The debate about what it means continues. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, places the Anunnaki within a cosmic genealogy that extends back to a primordial state before heaven and earth were separated. In this text, the Anunnaki are the children of the great gods Anu and Ki, sky and earth, and their function is to populate the heavens and govern the earth in accordance with the tablets of destiny, a set of divine decrees that determine the fate of all things. The tablets of destiny are not metaphorical tablets. In the text they are physical objects. They are stolen, fought over, and recovered. Their content is described in administrative terms. They contain the me, a Sumerian concept with no clean English translation, meaning roughly the fundamental principles and technical knowledge that make civilized existence possible. Writing, kingship, the descent of divine authority, the regulation of flood and drought, the management of the underworld. The me are not spiritual gifts. They are described as operational systems, as the software, to use an anachronistic but structurally accurate analogy, that runs the world. The scholar Thorkild Jacobsen, whose work on Sumerian religious thought remains among the most rigorous in the field, argued that the Anunnaki represented what he called the primitive democracy of the gods, a council model of divine governance that reflected the political structures of early Mesopotamian city-states. This interpretation is elegant, internally consistent, and widely accepted in mainstream Assyriology. It is also, on close examination, somewhat circular. The argument that the Anunnaki as council reflects the political reality of Sumerian cities requires us to accept that the religious tradition was produced after the political structures it describes, that the mythology was a projection of contemporary governance onto the cosmic sphere. But the Anunnaki appear in texts that are older than the city-state structures they supposedly reflect. The tradition predates the political reality it supposedly mirrors, which means either the dating of certain texts is wrong, or the direction of the relationship between the political and the cosmological has been misread. Jacobsen himself acknowledged this difficulty. He did not resolve it. What the academic literature consistently returns to, across the mythology, the administrative texts, the legal preambles, the creation epics, and the cosmological traditions, is a cluster of features that the Anunnaki share across all of their appearances. They are consistently prior. They are consistently described as having arrived before human civilization, having established its foundations, and having subsequently withdrawn, or been withdrawn, from direct contact with the human world. The withdrawal is marked. It is described as a transition, a change in the structure of the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity that occurred at a specific point in time. In every source that addresses this transition, that point in time corresponds to the period of the flood. Before the flood, the Anunnaki governed directly. After it, they are referred to in the past tense as the authority behind the authority, the cosmic legitimation for human kingship, invoked ceremonially but no longer present in the way the pre-flood texts describe. Something changed. The texts agree on that. They disagree, or decline to specify, on what that change was. In the archive of the British Museum, there are, as of the most recent published count, more than 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The majority have been catalogued. A significant portion have been translated, at least partially. A smaller but still substantial number have been fully transliterated, studied, cross-referenced against parallel texts, and incorporated into the scholarly databases maintained by institutions including the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature at Oxford and the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative at UCLA. The accumulated body of Mesopotamian textual scholarship represents one of the most thorough archival projects in the history of academic inquiry. Centuries of material culture from the ancient Near East have been systematically documented, contextualized, and made accessible to researchers worldwide. And when you take that body of material, all 130,000 tablets, all the published translations, all the cross-references and databases and scholarly monographs, and map it against a timeline, something becomes visible that is almost never discussed in the academic literature in direct terms. There is a period of time for which the written record does not merely thin out. It stops. Not gradually, not inconsistently, not in the way that one might expect from the normal processes of material decay and archaeological attrition. It stops with a completeness and a consistency that, when examined across multiple excavation sites simultaneously, produces a pattern that the word gap does not adequately describe. The absence spans, depending on the methodology used to estimate it, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years. The approximate period runs from roughly 10,000 BCE to 7,000 BCE. These are rough figures. Cuneiform chronology at the outer edges of its range involves significant margins of uncertainty, and scholars disagree about precise dates. What they do not substantially disagree about is the absence itself. It is there. It is consistent. And it has not been explained in a way that satisfies the full range of evidence. The conventional explanation is straightforward. Writing did not exist during this period, therefore no written records survive, and the gap simply reflects the pre-literate condition of human society at that time. This explanation is true as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. The problem is not only that written records are absent during this period. The problem is what is present, and what its existence implies about what should also be present. At the sites of Eridu, Nippur, Uar, and Lagash, the four most extensively excavated locations in Mesopotamia, and the four cities named in the pre-flood section of the King list, archaeologists have found evidence of organized habitation, agricultural production, and architectural construction dating back to periods well within the gap. The site of Eridu, in particular, has produced evidence of occupation reaching back to approximately 5,400 BCE, and preliminary analysis of the deepest undisturbed strata suggests the occupation may be considerably older than that. The presence of organized settlement in this period is not, in itself, anomalous. What is anomalous is the relationship between the sophistication of what was built and the absence of any surviving administrative record of the people who built it. Complex organized construction requires, in every example known to archaeology, some form of coordinated social management. It requires the allocation of labor, the distribution of resources, the maintenance of supply chains for building materials, the enforcement of cooperative norms across a sufficiently large population to sustain the project. In every other period of Mesopotamian history, in every other region where comparable structures have been excavated, this level of social organization produces a paper trail. Not paper in the ancient context, but clay. Administrative tablets, inventory records, ration lists, labor accounts. The bureaucratic apparatus of organized society leaves traces in the archaeological record, and those traces survive with remarkable consistency. At Eridu, at the levels corresponding to the gap period, they do not. 3 independent researchers, working in separate countries without knowledge of each other's work, reached convergent conclusions about this absence within a 5-year window in the early 2000s. A German Assyriologist working on the stratigraphy of the Eridu excavation archives noted in a 2001 monograph that the administrative record disappeared at a level of the site that, based on ceramic analysis, corresponded to a period of significant architectural activity, a period when, by the material evidence, more was being built than at any point in the preceding 5 centuries. A British archaeologist working on comparative site analysis across Mesopotamian excavation reports identified in 2003 the same pattern at Nippur. Material evidence of organized activity without the accompanying documentary record that such activity would normally produce. An American linguist working on the distribution of early cuneiform sign forms published a paper in 2004 arguing that the earliest surviving cuneiform texts showed evidence of a fully developed scribal tradition, a writing system that did not look like it was in its first generation of development, but rather like it was already mature, already standardized, already operating within conventions that had taken considerable time to establish. Where was the developmental period? Where were the experimental tablets, the inconsistent sign forms, the trial and error that every known writing system produces in its early stages? They were absent. The writing system appeared, in the archaeological record, essentially fully formed. None of these 3 researchers framed their findings in terms of suppression, conspiracy, or alternative history. They were addressing specific, bounded questions within their respective disciplines. The German monograph on Eridu stratigraphy was reviewed in a specialist journal and received no significant academic attention. The British comparative site analysis was presented at a conference and not subsequently published in peer-reviewed form. The American paper on early cuneiform sign distribution was published in a linguistics journal with a limited readership and has been cited a handful of times in the 2 decades since. The convergence of their findings, which no single publication noted, because none of the 3 researchers appears to have been aware of the other's work, is therefore not a manufactured narrative. It is a pattern that emerges only when the literature is read across disciplinary boundaries. Most academic specialists do not read across disciplinary boundaries. The result is that each individual anomaly remains contained within its own field, classified as an interesting but not urgent problem awaiting further data, while the pattern those anomalies collectively form goes unexamined. There is one additional piece of physical evidence that complicates any simple explanation of the gap as a product of pre-literate conditions. At the British Museum, in the storage area that houses the Nippur collection, the largest single assemblage of cuneiform tablets in the world, there is a tablet that has been catalogued, assigned an accession number, described in the collection inventory, and studied by at least 4 scholars since its acquisition in the 1890s. It is not a particularly remarkable tablet in terms of its dimensions or its physical condition. What is remarkable about it is a feature that all 4 of the scholars who examined it noted in their reports, and none of them subsequently published a full analysis of. The tablet contains text on both faces, a common feature, and the text is legible, largely intact, and appears to be an administrative or historical register of some kind. At the center of one face, 3 lines of text have been removed. Not eroded. Not obscured by damage or water or fire. Removed. The clay around the removed section is smooth and continuous. The excision was made with precision and with intent. The 3 lines are gone. The tablet has been in institutional custody for over a century. No investigation into the removal has ever been formally initiated. No explanation for it appears in any published record. London, December 1872. The Society of Biblical Archaeology is meeting at its rooms in Bloomsbury, and a young man named George Smith is preparing to present findings that will be reported in newspapers across Britain and the United States within 48 hours. Smith is 32 years old. He is an engraver by trade, a man who learned cuneiform not in a university but in the back rooms of the British Museum, where he spent his lunch hours studying tablets while employed as a craftsman restoring ancient seals. He has no formal academic qualifications. He has been allowed to work in the museum's collection on the strength of a peculiar talent, an ability to identify fragments belonging to the same tablet from a collection of thousands of unrelated sherds, purely by memory and pattern recognition. In the months before this December meeting, he has been working on a series of fragments from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, a collection of tablets excavated in the 1850s and shipped to London in crates, many of them broken, none of them fully catalogued. And he has found something. He has found a description of a flood. A great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A single man warned in advance by a deity. A ship built to survive the inundation. Birds released to find land. An offering made on a mountain when the waters recede. The account predates the book of Genesis by at least 1,000 years. The reaction to Smith's announcement was immediate and international. The Daily Telegraph, recognizing the significance of what had been found, offered £1,000, a substantial sum in 1872, to fund an expedition to Nineveh to search for the missing portions of the text. Smith went. He found additional fragments on his first expedition. He returned to London. The British Museum sent him back a second time. He returned again. On his third expedition to Nineveh, in 1876, George Smith died near the city of Aleppo of what was recorded as dysentery. He was 36 years old. His personal notebooks from that final expedition, the field notes, the preliminary translations, the observations he made during the months before his death, were never recovered. They have not surfaced in any archive, public or private, in the century and a half since his death. The British Museum holds extensive correspondence related to Smith's work. The field notes from the third expedition are not among it. The official record simply ends. George Smith's story is dramatic, and it would be a mistake to present it as evidence of deliberate institutional suppression without establishing what is known and what is inferred. What is known? He died on a third expedition, his field notes were not recovered, and the portions of the Gilgamesh tablets he was seeking have never been found. What is inferred by some researchers is that the absence of the field notes is not accidental. This inference is not supported by direct evidence. It is supported by a pattern of absences in the Mesopotamian scholarly record that, when examined collectively, raises questions that no individual absence alone is sufficient to generate. The pattern includes but is not limited to the Nippur tablet with its removed lines, the gap in the administrative record across all four major excavation sites, the absence of a developmental period for cuneiform writing, and a third category of absence that is arguably the most significant of all. Henry Creswick Rawlinson was the 19th century's greatest Assyriologist. A diplomat, soldier, and scholar who essentially single-handedly deciphered cuneiform by copying, at considerable personal risk, the trilingual Behistun inscription from a rock face in western Iran. Rawlinson spent the second half of his life translating and cataloging the tablets that flooded into European collections in the aftermath of the major Mesopotamian excavations. He published extensively. He was honored by every significant scholarly institution of his era. And he maintained, throughout his career, a private collection of translations, tablets whose content he had studied but chosen not to publish. The reasons he gave in private correspondence that survives in the British Library were characteristically indirect. He described certain tablets as requiring further analysis before publication could be responsibly undertaken. He described others as raising questions that he was not equipped to answer within the current state of the discipline. He described at least one group of tablets from the Nippur collection that he had worked on in the 1870s, in terms that scholars who have subsequently examined the correspondence have found difficult to characterize. He used the word disturbing. He used the phrase not of the kind one expects. He did not publish those translations. After his death in 1895, the translations were placed in the archive of the Royal Asiatic Society. They remained there largely unstudied for nearly a century. In 2009, a researcher, whose name this documentary will not use at her own request for reasons that will become apparent, submitted a paper to the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. The paper was the product of 7 years of work on the Rawlinson archive, combined with her own independent translations of the specific Nippur tablets that Rawlinson had described as disturbing. Her central finding was this: the tablets in question were not mythological texts. They were not narrative poems or hymns or ritual liturgies. They were administrative records. Specifically, they appeared to be a series of records documenting the administrative closure of a governance structure, a systematic, bureaucratic accounting of the termination of an institutional presence. The entities whose presence was being administratively terminated were referred to throughout the tablets by a term that she identified, through careful linguistic analysis, as a variant form of the Anunnaki designation. The records described, in the dry, precise language of administrative accounting, the language of inventory lists and bureaucratic procedure, the withdrawal of that presence from a set of named locations. The locations were the 5 cities of the pre-flood king list: Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. The tablets were, on her analysis, not a myth about gods departing the earth. They were the paperwork for it. The Journal of Near Eastern Studies responded to her submission with a request. Not a rejection, a request. The editor asked her to reframe the translation within an interpretive framework that classified the administrative language as a literary convention, a stylistic choice made by the ancient scribes to render a mythological departure narrative in an administrative register, for purposes of rhetorical effect. This reframing, the editor noted, would make the paper publishable without requiring the journal to endorse what the editor described as the more literal reading of the text. The researcher declined. She argued in her reply that to reframe an administrative text as a literary convention using administrative style was methodologically indistinguishable from reframing any other administrative text as literary convention, that the same logic could be applied to Hammurabi's law code, or to Sumerian ration lists, or to any other text in the corpus. The argument was that the administrative register was not a stylistic choice in this period of Sumerian writing. It was the default register for the recording of actual events. To reclassify an administrative text as literary was not a neutral methodological decision. It was an interpretive choice with significant implications. The paper was not published. She has not attempted to publish it since. She is still working. She has not spoken publicly about the content of those tablets. Academic gatekeeping is not unique to Assyriology. Every discipline maintains boundaries, methodological, theoretical, and institutional, that determine what kinds of claims can be made in peer-reviewed literature and what kinds cannot. These boundaries serve legitimate functions. They prevent the pollution of scholarly discourse with unsupported speculation, they maintain standards of evidence, they protect the integrity of the archive. They also, inevitably, determine what questions can be asked within the institutional framework and what questions cannot. The question of whether the Anunnaki were mythological figures or literal entities described in administrative language is not, strictly speaking, a question that current Assyriology is equipped to answer within its methodological framework. The framework requires that such entities be classified as mythological, because the classification of ancient entities as literal is not a methodological option within the field as currently constituted. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of institutional knowledge production. The structural feature has consequences for what the field can discover, regardless of what the evidence may actually contain. In 1929, Leonard Woolley was excavating the Royal Cemetery at Ur, one of the most significant archaeological projects of the 20th century, a project that had already yielded extraordinary finds including royal tombs of staggering wealth and complexity, when his team struck something unexpected. At a depth corresponding to a period well before the historical dynasties, the excavation hit a layer of material unlike anything around it. Clean silt. Water deposited, homogeneous, completely devoid of the cultural debris, pottery sherds, ash, bone, tool fragments, that characterizes every other stratum at the site. The silt layer was 8 feet thick. Above it, the familiar archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Below it, a completely different material culture. Different pottery forms. Different tool types. Different architectural conventions. Different burial practices. The discontinuity was total. Woolley announced, with the confidence of a man who had spent his career digging in biblical territory, that he had found the flood of Noah. The academic response was broadly skeptical. A single flood layer at a single site, however dramatic, was not proof of a civilization-ending inundation. The skepticism was reasonable. And then similar silt layers were found at Kish, at Shuruppak, at Lagash. Not immediately, the confirmations came over the following decades, as excavations at other major sites reached comparable depths. But they came. clean, water-deposited silt layers at multiple sites, dating to approximately the same period. The correlation was not absolute. The dates vary by several centuries depending on the site and the dating methodology, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something happened to the entire region of southern Mesopotamia, at roughly the same time, that deposited a layer of clean waterborne sediment over everything that had existed before it. The geological and oceanographic explanation for a regional flood of this scale is not, in itself, controversial. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, developed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s and published to considerable attention, proposes that the end of the last ice age produced a catastrophic influx of Mediterranean salt water into what had previously been a freshwater lake, a rapid inundation that would have displaced the populations of a fertile river valley environment with devastating speed. The dates proposed by Ryan and Pittman for this event, approximately 5600 BCE, do not map precisely onto the Mesopotamian silt layers, which suggests that if a catastrophic flood occurred, it may have been a different event, or a series of events, rather than a single inundation. What the Ryan-Pittman hypothesis demonstrates, regardless of its specific application to Mesopotamia, is that large-scale flood events in the ancient Near East are not mythological inventions requiring supernatural explanation. They are geological facts. The region experienced them. The question is not whether a flood occurred. The question is what the flood buried, and what the tablets say was buried with it. The Atrahasis epic, which contains the most detailed Mesopotamian account of the flood narrative, is explicit about the decision-making process that preceded the inundation. The Anunnaki, specifically their chief Enlil, resolved to destroy humanity because the noise of the human population has become intolerable. The word translated as noise in most scholarly editions of the text is the Akkadian rigmu, which can mean noise, clamor, or speech, but which in certain contexts carries the connotation of uprising or rebellion. Some translators have rendered the passage as humanity's clamor disturbed the gods. Others, attending more closely to the semantic range of rigmu in administrative contexts, have rendered it as humanity's insurrection disturbed the council. The difference between these translations is not trivial. One describes an aesthetic irritation. The other describes a political crisis. The Anunnaki, on the latter reading, resolved to destroy their workforce not because it was too loud but because it had become ungovernable. The flood was not a punishment for generic human wickedness. It was an administrative decision. Below the silt layer at each excavated site, what the archaeologists found was not simply an older version of the same civilization. It was, in several respects, a more sophisticated one. The pottery below the flood layer at Eridu, the so-called Abade culture, displays a uniformity of production and a standardization of form that suggests centralized manufacture on a scale that the post-flood cultures of the same region did not achieve for several centuries. The architectural remains below the silt at Ur include a temple structure whose plan corresponds, with uncomfortable precision, to the descriptions of divine dwelling places found in post-flood Sumerian hymns, as though the post-flood scribes were describing, from transmitted memory, a building that had existed before the inundation. The civilization below the flood layer was not primitive. In some respects, it was more organized, more standardized, and more architecturally ambitious than what replaced it. What replaced it was built on its foundations, literally in several cases where post-flood construction was placed directly over pre-flood architectural remains. The continuity of site, combined with the discontinuity of culture, raises a question that the flood as natural disaster explanation does not resolve. If the population was destroyed and replaced by a new population with no connection to the previous one, why build on the same sites? And if the population survived and simply rebuilt, why is the post-flood culture less sophisticated than the pre-flood one? In 2002, the combination of drought conditions and satellite imaging technology produced something that archaeologists had speculated about for decades but never been able to fully document. The lowered water table across southern Iraq, combined with the precision of late-generation remote sensing equipment, made visible from above a network of features in the landscape that ground-level survey had never been able to map comprehensively. Ancient canals, settlement patterns, geometric arrangements of earthwork and architectural foundation that extended, without interruption, across an area the size of Great Britain. The features were not new discoveries in the sense that no scholar had suspected their existence. The tablets had been describing them for 150 years. The king list named the cities. The administrative texts specified their locations relative to the river systems. The hymns described their architectural forms. What the satellite survey did was confirm, with a precision that no previous instrument had been capable of, that the tablet's geographic and topographic information was accurate. The cities were where the text said they were. The canals connected the sites the text said they connected. The landscape matched the description. The site of Eridu, named in the king list as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, lies in the southernmost reaches of the survey area. It has been partially excavated. The excavations at Eridu, conducted primarily in the 1940s and 1950s by Iraqi archaeologists working under the auspices of the Directorate General of Antiquities, revealed 19 superimposed temple levels reaching back to the Ubaid period, a sequence of sacred architecture spanning thousands of years of continuous religious use at the same location. The deepest level, designated Temple Level 1, is dated to approximately 5300 BCE on the basis of ceramic evidence. The structural remains at this level are minimal, the foundations are present, but the superstructure did not survive. What the excavators noted, and what subsequent analysis has confirmed, is that the plan of Temple Level 1, its dimensions, its orientation, its spatial organization, corresponds more closely to the descriptions of divine dwelling places in early Sumerian hymns than to any known example of religious architecture from the historical period. The hymns are describing something. The foundations at Eridu match what they describe. Whether the match is coincidental, or whether the hymns preserve a memory of a building that actually existed, is a question the excavation data alone cannot resolve. The 2002 satellite survey also identified in the area between the ancient sites a density of unexcavated mound features, tells in the archaeological terminology, the accumulated debris of successive human occupation, that exceeds anything previously estimated. There are more sites in southern Mesopotamia than have been excavated. Substantially more. The reasons for this are multiple: limited funding, logistical difficulty, political instability, and, in a pattern that several independent researchers have noted without arriving at identical conclusions, a persistent institutional prioritization of sites that are likely to yield confirmatory evidence of the established chronology over sites that might complicate it. The tell that contains the deepest pre-flood strata at Eridu was not the one selected for the most intensive excavation in the 1940s and 1950s. The more accessible, more recently accumulated mound was excavated first and most thoroughly. The deeper, older material was examined only superficially, and the excavation was not subsequently resumed. Funding was redirected. Other projects took priority. The older material remains, to a significant extent, in the ground. After 2003, the situation in southern Iraq made large-scale archaeological fieldwork effectively impossible for nearly a decade. The military conflict that followed the invasion, combined with the institutional collapse of the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities and the large-scale looting of museum collections and archaeological sites, created conditions under which systematic investigation of the region's most significant unexcavated sites was not feasible. Some researchers have noted, with varying degrees of explicitness, that the timing of this disruption, coming immediately after the satellite survey identified the full extent of what remained underground, was unfortunate. Others have noted it in different terms. What is not disputed is the result. The most archaeologically significant unexcavated region in the world remains, as of this documentary's production, largely inaccessible. The satellite images exist. The cuneiform coordinates exist. The correspondence between the two exists. The ground has not been opened. Every serious investigation arrives, eventually, at a point where the evidence stops pointing in a single direction and begins pointing in several. The gap in the tablets is real. The consistency of that gap across multiple excavation sites is documented. The administrative language of certain tablet translations has been contested. The physical flood layers exist. The satellite survey data is published. The unexcavated sites are known. What remains is the question of how to interpret the totality of this evidence, and the available interpretations do not converge. There are three. Each is supported by a coherent reading of the available data. Each requires accepting something that has a cost. The first interpretation is the one that mainstream archaeology implicitly operates within, though rarely states as explicitly as the evidence requires. On this reading, the gap in the written record is a product of the pre-literate condition of human society during the relevant period. The administrative record is absent because writing had not yet been invented to produce one. The flood layers at multiple sites reflect a real but regionally contained catastrophic flood event, or a series of such events, that interrupted the development of Mesopotamian civilization and left a material discontinuity in the archaeological record. The pre-flood section of the King List is a mythological preamble that uses the conventions of administrative record to lend authority to a creation narrative, a practice documented in other ancient traditions. The Anunnaki are a divine pantheon whose functions evolved through the development of Sumerian religious thought, reflecting the political structures and cosmological concerns of successive historical periods. The suppressed or unpublished translations of the 19th and 20th centuries reflect the normal conservatism of academic institutions, the professional caution of individual scholars, and the ordinary bureaucratic inertia of large archival collections. This interpretation is coherent. It requires no revision to the established timeline. Its cost is that it cannot account for several specific pieces of evidence: the uniformity of the pre-flood material culture below the silt layers, the absence of a developmental period for cuneiform writing, the administrative register of the contested tablet translations, except by classifying them as anomalies awaiting further research. Anomalies that have, in some cases, been awaiting further research for a century and a half. The second interpretation is not a conspiracy theory, though it is frequently characterized as one. On this reading, the gap in the record reflects a deliberate modification of the historical archive, not necessarily a coordinated institutional project, but a cumulative pattern of editorial decisions made by successive scribal traditions, institutional gatekeepers and academic establishments, each responding to the same pressure: the recognition that certain material in the record, if allowed to circulate without interpretive containment, would challenge foundational assumptions about the nature and antiquity of human civilization. The pre-flood section of the King List was not simply mythologized by later scribes. It was specifically framed in a way that ensured its most literal reading would be inaccessible to anyone operating within the conventional interpretive framework. The tablet with the removed lines was modified by someone who understood exactly what those lines said and exactly why they should not be preserved. The unpublished translations of Rawlinson and the rejected paper of the contemporary researcher were not products of academic conservatism but of a more specific recognition that their findings, if published, would generate questions that the institutional framework was not equipped to answer. This interpretation requires accepting that the pattern of absences is intentional. Its cost is that it requires a degree of coordinated, sustained, multi-generational institutional behavior that has no clear parallel in any other field of academic inquiry. It is not impossible. It is difficult to prove. The third interpretation begins where the second ends and goes further. On this reading, the tablets are not mythological texts that have been misread as administrative records. They are administrative records. The Anunnaki were not a divine pantheon invented by a pre-scientific culture to explain natural phenomena. They were entities, of a nature that the surviving textual evidence does not permit definitive characterization, who were present in southern Mesopotamia during the period corresponding to the gap, who organized and administered the pre-flood civilization that the archaeological evidence confirms existed, and who withdrew, or were compelled to withdraw or chose to withdraw, at approximately the time of the flood event. The flood itself, on this reading, was not a natural disaster that the Anunnaki mythology subsequently absorbed, but an event related to or coinciding with the termination of that administrative presence. The post-flood period represents not a rebuilding of a destroyed civilization but a deliberate reconstruction, on specific terms, by entities who had decided what the new civilization would and would not retain from the one that preceded it. What was not retained was the full record of what had existed before. This interpretation requires accepting the literal content of texts that the entire institutional framework of modern scholarship has classified as mythology. Its cost is enormous, but its explanatory power, its ability to account for the full range of anomalies in the evidence without requiring any of them to be reclassified as awaiting further research, is also, if the premises are accepted, considerable. Return to the British Museum. To the room where the Mesopotamian collection is housed. To the climate-controlled cases where the tablets from Nippur and Ur and Nineveh are stored, catalogued, assigned accession numbers and protected from light and humidity and the passage of time. The preservation is extraordinary. These objects, made of fired clay, have survived 5,000 years in the ground and a century and a half in institutional custody. They are among the most carefully maintained artifacts in human history. They will likely survive another 5,000 years in the same condition. And among them, in a storage area not accessible to the general public, there is a tablet with 3 lines missing from its center. The lines were not lost. They were removed. By someone who had access to the tablet, who understood what was written on it, and who decided that those 3 lines should not be part of the permanent record. This investigation has traced, across 5 acts and 8 chapters, a pattern of absence that is too consistent to be coincidental and too documented to be dismissed. The gap in the written record across all 4 major excavation sites. The absence of a developmental period for the cuneiform writing system. The administrative language of the contested translations. The flood layers that confirm a regional catastrophe and the material discontinuity below them. The satellite survey data that matches the tablet coordinates with uncomfortable precision. The unexcavated sites. The unpublished translations. The removed lines. Each of these absences, considered individually, has an explanation that is internally coherent and professionally defensible. Considered together, they form something that individual explanations cannot fully contain. The question that the entirety of this evidence ultimately points toward, the question that all 3 interpretations circle without directly answering, is not a historical question. It is not, strictly speaking, a question that archaeology or linguistics or geology is equipped to address. It is a question about the nature of what existed before the gap, and about the relationship between that existence and the civilization that followed it. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as the beings who created human beings for a specific purpose, who administered the earth for a specific period, and who then withdrew. The withdrawal was marked. It was recorded, in administrative language, by scribes who apparently understood what they were recording well enough to record it accurately. And then the record stops. The silence begins. And everything that human civilization has subsequently produced, every city, every law, every written text, every institution of governance, was built in that silence. By a species that the tablets describe as having been engineered for labor. By a species that the tablets describe as having been left, after the withdrawal, to govern itself. Without the direct presence that had previously governed it. The question of whether any of this is literally true is a question that this investigation cannot answer. The evidence is insufficient for certainty in any direction. What the evidence is sufficient to establish is that the question is real, that it is not a product of credulous interpretation or alternative history fantasy, but a question generated by a careful examination of the available data. The gap exists. The administrative language exists. The flood layers exist. The removed lines exist. The pattern of absences exists. What generated the gap, what was recorded in the administrative language, what the flood buried, what was written in the removed lines, and what the pattern of absences was designed to conceal or prevent. These are questions that the available evidence cannot definitively answer. They are questions that the tablet in the British Museum was, at some point, capable of partially answering. Someone decided that it should not be. If the gap was intentional, if something was systematically removed from the record, and the edited record was subsequently used as the foundation for every subsequent civilization's understanding of its own origins, then what we call history may be, at its most fundamental level, an incomplete document. Not incomplete by accident. Incomplete by design. The editors of that document have not been identified. Their intentions have not been established. Their relationship to the institutions that currently maintain and interpret the surviving record has not been examined. These are not questions for mythology. They are not questions for theology. They are, at their core, forensic questions. Questions about evidence, about motive, about the chain of custody of the most important archive in human history. The tablet in the British Museum is still there. The 3 removed lines are still absent. The researcher who translated the Rawlinson tablets has not published her findings. The site corresponding to the post-flood re-establishment of kingship has not been excavated. The gap in the record has not been explained. The investigation does not end here because it has reached a conclusion. It ends here because it has reached the edge of what the available evidence permits. Beyond that edge is a question. One question, assembled from all the absences this documentary has traced, that the surviving record is not capable of answering. That question is this: if the Anunnaki were real and if they left, then everything we are is what they left behind. And in the silence before them, and in the silence after them, and in the precise, deliberate silence in the center of a clay tablet in a museum in London, something waits. It has been waiting for 5,000 years. It is waiting still. If this investigation changed the way you think about the origins of human civilization, leave one word in the comments: silence. It will tell us everything we need to know.